Welcome back to the channel, guys. Q&A this week. The first question comes from Ben. And yes, what are my thoughts on a flexible kind of training template? So with weekly volume being the major player in hypertrophy, could you use a checklist each week and work on getting everything done based on how you feel each day? Obviously, keeping in proper progression, etc. Just a thought versus a more normal split. So essentially using some sort of checklist to where, okay, I have this much volume to do each week, and I can just complete this volume based on how I'm feeling each day. And if I operate under the assumption that weekly volume is the most important factor in hypertrophy, which I think is true, then with this sort of flexible approach, you still make sure to get in your weekly training volume. So overall, I think that something like this could definitely work. And I think that if you're getting that biggest rock in your weekly volume while also having a kind of progression scheme like you mentioned here, I think that that can absolutely work. Now, some potential pitfalls might be basing things or basing your training based on just how you feel. And I know that people will fall on kind of both ends of this, to where some people might always be like, well, I feel really good. I feel great. I can do more and more. And with something this flexible, they might finish their program or finish their volume in their first 3 sessions. And then they might be like, well, now what do I do? And on the flip side, some people might sandbag a little bit and everything's not perfect today. I can't go in and train. And I don't think that that would be the best approach either. So I think that this would work for a certain type of person that kind of really knows themselves well. But I absolutely think that the idea behind this can definitely work. And I think that something that I more commonly implement, and before I touch on that, I would also say that this would probably be best if it was couched in some sort of like frequency minimum, to where it's like, hey, we have this amount of weekly volume that we want to get, but still make sure to train your muscles at least twice per week. And then I think if you did that, it would make this a lot better. So what this tends to look like with my clients is more like, okay, we're still going to have like a 4 or 5 day split, but your rest days can be floating. Meaning we have a 4-day split, but if you have something going on and you're really busy, or you're just not feeling good that day, you didn't sleep well the night before, something like that, feel free to use one of those rest days and just push your training back a day. And that is pretty dang similar to this, but just a little bit more structure there, to where it's like, okay, I have my normal training days, but if something comes up, I can just move my rest days around and be totally fine. Now, if we really want to get into kind of the details here, we could make the argument that at some point during your accumulation, you probably shouldn't feel that great in your training. So like the week before a deload, like there's going to be sessions to where you might still have a little bit of soreness here and there, a little bit of fatigue. You're not feeling awesome. Then I could see this maybe not working quite as well, because we are expecting a certain level of fatigue, and I wouldn't want to just push those sessions back. I would want to purposefully feel a little bit more kind of fatigued going into those sessions, and maybe overreach just a touch going into that deload. So just playing that by feel might not be best. And if your training days are are spaced far differently from week to week, it might change your accumulation of training stress from week to week. So if you had 3 days between your chest days last week, but this week you have 5, well, it could be more difficult to track progression because you're training your chest with different rates of recovery between days, and it might make your fatigue a little bit less predictable and may also make your performance a little different depending on how many days you have between rest and stuff like that. But over time, that should kind of wash itself out. So ultimately, I definitely think a more kind of flexible approach like this could absolutely make sense. And I would just kind of couch it maybe with a frequency minimum, and then maybe also have a kind of regular template that you usually train on these days. And then if something comes up, just move your days around a little bit. And I think that you kind of get the best of both worlds a little bit there. All right. So hopefully that helps out, Ben. Second question was in regards to my experience of returning to the gym. Did I lose any muscle, and did I lose strength, stuff like that? And I would say that I do feel like I may have lost a little bit of muscle. And I would say definitely more kind of prominent in my lower body. And that kind of makes sense. Like when I was training at home, all I could really do was lunges and stuff like that. And when I got back into the gym, it was like my lower body responded really well and was back to normal within a month or two. Now, I was out of the gym for about 7 or 8 weeks, something like that, I think. Or maybe even, I'm trying to think back now, maybe 2 or 3 months. And my strength did drop to some degree, but not a ton. Like, I think it took me like two full mesocycles, and I was basically back to my previous strength levels for my lower body and upper body. So it took me a second, maybe 1 to 2 mesocycles to kind of get back into things, but for the most part, it didn't take too long. And upper body, I didn't notice a big difference. Like when I got back into the gym, I got more kind of pumped up again and my muscles filled out a little bit more, but I don't think I think that's all that was. I don't think I actually lost tissue. But for my lower body, I do think that there was, when I got back, a little bit more of a size difference between where I am now, like 2 or 3 months back into it, versus where I was a little bit ago. And I do think that my size on my legs may have actually gone down a little bit, but I think that within just a couple months here, things are fine. So one thing that I would say is if you're getting back into the gym and stuff like that, give it a few mesocycles. It might take up to maybe half of the length that you were out of the gym to kind of get back to normal and stuff. I think that's a decent rule of thumb. Like if you were out of the gym for 6 months, well, it might take 2 to 4 months for you to kind of return back to where you were. But it will come back pretty quickly, and make sure you ease into it. Like I started most of my clients out with just one challenging set, especially if it was an exercise that is more stressful. So like RDLs, squats, stuff like that, like one set. And they were all sore. They were all like, oh, I didn't think that this was going to be enough. And then they're all like, okay, I still got sore from this. If I would have done more, I would have been wrecked. So ease into it, especially on those exercises that are more stressful, and it'll come back pretty quick. Or at least that was my experience, and that's most of the experience with my clients. All right. So I appreciate the question there. Next question, thoughts on increasing volume versus static volume. Wow. So this could be an entire hour-long podcast, but in short, is in brief a saying? It is now. So I would say that both approaches can work. I think that I still think that it makes more sense to accumulate volume throughout a mesocycle, at least to some degree. I don't think it needs to be crazy, but I think that while I don't think that our our needed stimulus for growth changes a ton across the mesocycle. Like, I don't think that in week 1 we need or in week 4 that we need drastically more sets, like 100% more volume than week 1 to grow. And I think that it does make sense to adjust your volume based on your rate of adaptation rather than just what you did last week. And since we know adaptations take a long time to take place with building muscle, well, applying that overload or that increase in volume or any other forms of overload, we want to apply that overload based on what we've already adapted to previously. So if adaptations take a long time to take place, then that tells me that we probably don't need to worry about these short-term overload or this short-term progressive overload, like on a week-to-week basis. We probably don't need to really worry about that a whole lot, as our adaptations last week are probably pretty similar to this week. Like, in 1 week, we probably haven't adapted a ton. So what was overloading last week, probably going to be overloading this week. But then if you start to look at a year, 2 years, 3 years, well, what was overloading 2 years ago, depending on where your advancement was, might not be much for you now. So over the time course there, I definitely think that increasing that overload makes sense. But on a week-to-week basis, is that really needed? Probably not. So that makes more of an argument for kind of static volume. However, I think that the catch to this is that when you come off a deload in week 1 of your program, you just can't recover from nearly as much volume as what you were recovering from previously. So I definitely think that it makes sense to start a mesocycle at a lower level of volume so you don't end up kind of under-recovered throughout your mesocycle and just catching up on recovery. So I think that it makes sense to start out at a lower level of volume. But then I also don't think that it would make sense to just kind of stay there, because after our first week, usually our recovery capabilities increase and we can handle more volume and potentially benefit from a little bit more. So I think that by starting out on the lower end and then working to the higher end, it's not necessarily that I think that we're adapting each week and we have to apply progressive overload and stuff like that. It's more so, I think that we're just staying in our MRV better that way, because we start out a little bit lower, and then as we can recover from more, it makes sense to maybe potentially do a little bit more if we have some upside to, hey, more volume to a point tends to work pretty well for growing muscles. So if there's upside to that, which I think that there probably is, why wouldn't we at least scale volume to some degree across the mesocycle? So does it have to be a 100% increase from week 1? No, but I still think it makes sense. Maybe you go from 10 to 15 sets. Like, that's still a significant increase, and that's what it ends up looking like for a lot of clients. It's usually like a 6 to 8 set difference between week 1 and the final week. And I think that approach works well. And I think that if you just stayed at static volume, well, in week 1, it may end up being a little bit too much. But then you're kind of behind on recovery the entire mesocycle, and then it just doesn't go really well. But if you just stayed at kind of a low volume in week 1, well, you may leave a little bit of gains on the table by not scaling that volume a little bit, as more recoverable volume tends to work pretty well for growing muscle. So I'm still a fan of scaling volume, at least to some degree, starting out a little bit lower, and then to make sure that we stay within our recovery capabilities, and then stepping it up a little bit each week. But, if someone started with kind of an intro week to not overdo it in the first week, and then they just stepped it up once and then kind of kept it there, I still think that would work pretty well. And I still think it does work well. All right. So the take homes of this point is, I think that your progressive overload should be scaled based on your rate of adaptation, and adaptations take a long time to take place. So you don't need to hashtag progressive overload each and every single week. But I do think that it still makes sense to scale volume to some degree, as in that first week, our recovery capabilities just aren't there. And if we can potentially benefit or grow a little bit better from more recoverable volume, then I still think it makes sense to step it up a little bit each week. All right. So hopefully that makes sense there. I think both approaches can work, and I don't think it has to be either or in all situations. All right. So my final question here: how long should you diet in one diet without maintenance phases? So very common question. I actually just heard a podcast with Mike Israetel talk about this, and basically he was like, hey, you probably don't want to lose much more than 10% of your body weight in one single diet. So if I'm 180 pounds, I probably don't want to lose much more than 18 pounds in one single fat loss phase. That's probably about the max. And then after that, it's probably a good idea to take a maintenance phase, not just a deload and diet break, but a phase. And his suggestion is, hey, this should probably be around 2/3 of the length of the diet. So if it took me 12 weeks to lose that 18 pounds, well, I might be looking at a 8-week kind of maintenance phase. Now, I would say that is definitely a good rule of thumb, but it's not a hard line. Like, I've had quite a few clients that I'll go through like a 12-week fat loss phase to where we lose quite a bit of weight. We might lose 10% of their body weight, but I usually follow that up with one single maintenance mesocycle. However, think about both sides of that. So they are going to be they finish their fat loss phase, they deload and diet break. That's 1 week. And then we're probably doing 3 or 4 weeks of maintenance training and maintenance eating. So let's say it is 4 weeks. Well, that puts us at 5, and then we'll have another deload and maintenance kind of break after that. So that is 6 weeks there. So that ends up being about half of the length of the diet. Could we do 1 more week there in our phase, or 2 more? Yes, but I do think that deload 4 weeks, deload after a 12-week phase works pretty well, especially if someone like didn't go far below their settling point and stuff like that. They feel pretty good. I think one maintenance phase tends to work pretty well there. All right, but that really allows you to drop fatigue and set you up well for your kind of next gaining phase. All right, so that's all I got this week, guys. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate your time. I love seeing your comments and all that stuff. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in that next one.